Let's take just the back squat itself, for example. Would you say that there's a better way to perform the back squat itself, or maybe a worse way? Or, nowadays there's a lot of talk around there is no right technique. Any technique can work.
One general rule to follow when squatting is that we want to keep the curves. And we don't want to be flexing and extending that spine under load. That's generally considered to be a bad thing. Another thing that would be a bad thing is what is often referred to as valgus collapse, where the knees are coming in, or you're getting more knock-kneed as you end up flexing your knees.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Movement and Performance Podcast, where it is my goal to help people get active and to reconnect with their body. Today, I have with me Sean Flanagan. He is a professor in the Kinesiology Department at California State University. Today, we'll be talking all about squats and the biomechanics of squats. How would you define biomechanics for the everyday person?
So I would say that the more formal definition would be the application of mechanical principles to living systems. And that's pretty broad, right? And biomechanists look more than just at the human body. What I do is looking at the human body. When I am talking to my friends, my parents, I would basically characterize biomechanics as being physics and engineering applied to the human body. Now, if you think about physics and what is physics, physics is really trying to uncover the laws or the rules by which the university operates. If we look at engineering, we think of engineering as applying those rules or those laws to try and make the world a better place. So if we flip that around, we talk about that in the context of human movement, biomechanists really kind of work in both realms. One, we're trying to uncover the rules that govern the way in which we move, and then we are trying to apply those rules to help people move better.
Yeah, I got to read the opening chapter of your book, and you use the analogy of the Matrix. Is there anything you could touch on with that? I just was reading it and I was like, oh, it just hit home for me. But what was the analogy you were making there?
Well, first of all, The Matrix is probably my favorite film of all time. So I will start off by saying that. And second of all, and I don't know how much to get into this for your listeners who haven't seen the film.
I'm sure many have.
But when Morpheus unplugs Neo from the Matrix, and then he re-enters him into a program within the Matrix, he tells him that he has to understand that this is a world that is governed by laws. Some of those laws can be broken, some of them can be bent, and that they can do all these incredible things once they understand that. I think the analogy is that even though we're not living in a computer simulation, or at least I don't think we're living in a computer simulation,
Right.
that we are in a world that's governed by laws. And if we understand those laws now, they can't be bent or broken, but understanding those laws can help us to perform better in everything from activities of daily living all the way up to elite performances in sport.
Yeah, I absolutely love it. So a lot of times when I'm reading research, I see two terms, kinematics, kinetics. Can you briefly just give a definition for the two? When I think of them, I'm normally thinking of kinematics as maybe more along the lines of technique and kinetics along the lines of force and producing force. But could you give a little insight on that?
Sure, we can think of kinematics is only describing motion without any real concern for what's causing that motion. So yes, I think making an analogy with technique is an appropriate one, because if you're looking at the way somebody's moving, you're going to say, hey, bend your knee more or straighten up more. That's all talking about things from a kinematics perspective. Kinetics, on the other hand, ends up being the causes of motion. So yes, those are forces and torques. And those can be forces and torques that would be both internal to the body and external to the body that will end up creating that motion.
Simple. Awesome. So diving a little bit into the squat. First off, before we even get into some of the technical pieces or the kinematics and the kinetics, and how would you define a squat? Because some people define it a little differently. So this way we at least know what we're talking about before we jump into it.
Sure. And I always think that that's an important place to go first, is
Right.
because if you don't have a mutually agreed upon definition of something, you could just be talking past each other.
Right.
I
Right.
think of a squat as being in a broader category of what I refer to as lower extremity flexion and extension patterns.
Mm.
So a lower extremity flexion pattern would be one where you are going to end up having triple flexion. So
Mm.
you'll have dorsiflexion, knee flexion, and hip flexion. Or for the lay listeners out there, you're bending your hip, your knee, and your ankle simultaneously, and that you're kind of lowering your whole mass down towards the ground.
Mm.
And then the up phase of a squat is what I would refer to as a lower extremity extension pattern. That's where you're going to reverse things, where you're going to have extension of the hip, extension of the knee, and plantar flexion of the ankle, also sometimes called triple extension, or you can think about straightening out all those joints that bent to lower you down. You straighten them out to raise yourself back up. And so
Mm.
I consider the squat to be part of the larger category of those lower extremity inflection patterns that would include things like sitting down or standing up out of a chair
Mm.
and a jump. And there's a lot more nuances. A jump isn't simply a fast squat, but it does have many of the same kinematic patterns associated with that lower extremity inflection pattern.
Mm. And would you say, many people classify exercise in different ways, but some people say knee dominant, hip dominant. Would you say that a squat is a more knee dominant exercise or not necessarily?
I would actually say no. And I'm
Mm.
really not sure where the whole origins of that squat being knee dominant
Mm.
exercise is. And from time
Mm.
to time, I've tried to like track down where that actually came from.
Mm.
But in my work and in other people's work, if you look, let's take a back squat as an example. And if you look at the torque demands that are placed on the lower extremity joints, and I
Mm.
guess I should maybe take a step back and say that a torque is the turning effect of a force.
Mm.
So the forces that your muscles are applying are what's actually going to be rotating your joints.
Mm.
They are creating torques about your joints in order to rotate your joints. But again, my work and the work of a lot of others has shown that if you look at where the greatest demands on a squat are, they are at the hip, they're not at the knee.
Mm.
Now, I don't know, maybe if you look at things from a kinematic perspective, that there could be more knee flexion than there is, say, hip flexion.
Mm.
But in terms of the kinetic demands that are imposed upon a squat, I've never understood where this popular conception of a knee dominant exercise comes from,
Mm.
because my definition of dominant is the major contributor.
Right.
The major contributor during most squats is going to end up being the hip extensors.
Interesting. And I'm sure different squats will vary across the spectrum. Would you say that? Like
Yes.
ranging between hip
Mhm.
and knee, right? Like, so if you're going lateral squat or, a lunge or a deep squat but I'm assuming that there would be this, range between hip and knee all throughout different ones.
Yes, and that goes back, I think, if we talk a little bit about maybe some of the rules that govern human movement,
Mm.
let's talk about some of the rules that would govern a squat.
Mm.
Now, I would say that in general, and this is heavily generalizing, and maybe we can get into some specifics a little bit later, but in terms of heavily generalizing, the more upright your trunk becomes, the greater the demand is going to be placed on the knee extensors, and the smaller demand is going to be placed on the hip extensors. Now, we could probably also talk about the ankle, or maybe we'll put a pin in that and circle back to what the ankle is actually doing during a squat.
Mm.
But if we just look at what's happening, say, at the knee and the hip, in general, if you have a more upright trunk, you are going to have a greater demand that's going to be placed at the knee and a smaller demand that's going to be placed at the hip.
Mm.
Conversely, the more forward lean or the greater the inclination that your trunk is, the greater demands are going to be placed on the hip and the smaller demands that are going to be placed on the knee.
Mm.
And you can think about that just in terms of if you just look at where the load is compared to where those joint centers are, that you can, I think, get an appreciation for that fact.
Mm. Yeah. It makes me think of the difference between a front squat and a back squat a little bit, where a front
Yes,
squat's probably more upright and a back squat, you're starting to get more of that lean.
Right. And I think we could go all the way if we really wanted to go in terms of what is where. A wall squat would probably be the most upright squat that you could perform. But then
Mm,
you're correct that based off of different implements that you use, a front squat is going to constrain you to the place where you would have to be more upright, because if you go with a more forward lean with a front squat, you're going to end up dumping the bar.
mm,
Similarly, if you have the barbell on your back, you have to have a greater forward lean, because the more upright you are, the more likely it is that you're going to fall backwards because
mm,
of where the whole center of mass of that system ends up being.
mm.
Because one of the things that is going to constrain the way in which you can perform a squat is that you have to keep the whole center of mass of that system, which would be the center mass of the body plus the center mass of the bar, over the base of support, which is going to be defined by the perimeter of the foot.
Mm,
So you kind of have to make these postural adjustments depending on the size of the load and where the load is placed. And that's
mm.
going to have a profound impact in terms of how you perform the squat, which is going to have a profound impact in terms of where the demands are going to be across the different joints.
Now, would you say, quote unquote, that one's better? Now, of course, what does the word better mean? But um, you know, I'm sure in my mind, the direction I would go is better for what?
Yes.
Are we talking about better for muscle building? We talking about, but you know, is there one that when I think better, I'm thinking more longevity and health span. Yes, we all want to go after performance. We want to build muscle, most of the population, but I do think it's important to consider the health of your body along the way. So is one better for longevity or health span or just mechanically in any way?
Well, let me turn around and ask you a question.
Yeah.
What is better for health and longevity, fruits or vegetables?
Yeah.
Right? You
Yeah.
need both in order to have an appropriate diet.
Right.
So, in terms of an appropriate movement diet, wouldn't you need to have both?
Variety.
Right. Now, I'm certainly not the one that came up with that analogy about movement diet and fruits and vegetables and making that comparison. I can't remember now off the top of my head who did, but I
Right.
don't want to give you all the impression that I came up with that analogy. I heard it
Right.
somewhere along the way and it kind of stuck with me.
Right.
But no, I would say that in terms of overall movement health, you need a steady diet of variety. And
Mm,
so I
I
would
love
say
that.
that, yeah, like why, unless you are actually going to be a professional power lifter, or not even a professional power lifter, let's say a competitive power lifter, where the back squat is your actual sport, that I would say that you need a diet of variety of performing different squats in different ways, rather than just saying, oh, this is the one best version of the squat to perform.
I love that. So now let's go another approach because that answers it very well. Let's take just the back squat itself, for example. Would you say that there's a better way to perform the back squat itself, or maybe a worse way? Or, I used to have, nowadays there's a lot of talk around there is no right technique.
Mm-hmm.
Any technique can work. I feel like I see that buzzing around Instagram and things like that. I used to have a professor that would say it's very hard to define good movement, but a lot of times you know what it looks like when you see it, and
Mm-hmm.
you know what it doesn't look like when you see it.
Right.
So yeah, if we took one specific one, like the goal was to be better at the back squat, would you say there is a better way to do it or a more efficient way than others?
Well, those are lots of different little points that you're hitting around, but
Yeah.
the short answer to that question would be no. Now, I
Mm,
certainly think that there are things that end up being problematic and that there are
mm,
things that we need to avoid. In general, it's considered to be more injury prone if you start flexing the spine under a load.
mm,
And that the spine can handle the best compressive loads when we have that neutral spine and we have that curvature, because arches end up being stronger than columns are.
mm,
And so I would say that one general rule to follow when squatting is that we want to keep the curves. And
mm,
we don't want to be flexing and extending that spine under load. That's generally considered to be a bad thing.
mm.
Another thing that would be a bad thing is what is often referred to as valgus collapse, where the knees are coming in or you're getting more knock-kneed as you end up flexing your knees. And that's also considered bad for a number of different reasons, which we can get into if you'd like. But that would be another one that I would say, yeah, you really need to avoid that. So I would say the two things to avoid would be flexing and extending the spine under load and going into that valgus collapse position.
Would you mind taking one of them and just diving into one, whichever one you prefer, either the flexion or the knee valgus?
Sure. So again, the spine is designed to kind of have this load that follows the curvature of the spine. Spine isn't designed necessarily for a direct vertical load, but one that's going to follow that curvature. And if you look at all of the architecture that survived since like ancient Roman times, they all have arches associated with them. Arches are considered to be good things and solid structures. And so when we are flexing and extending, we don't want motion to be occurring at the spine. You'll often sometimes refer to that popularly as the butt wink, where somebody's squatting down and all of a sudden they'll roll into this posterior pelvic tilt and they'll end up flexing their spine when they do so. And that's been shown to be a mechanism that would lead to a herniated disc. Additionally, there's been research that's shown that, you know, if you're leaning forward and you got a bar on your back, that you're going to have what we call an anterior shear force. So you're going to have a force that's actually going to be sliding, say, one vertebra forward potentially on another. And so you need to create constraint forces that is going to keep that in position. And a lot of that would fall into the erector spinae group, which are going to be your major long muscles of your back extensors. And research has shown that you can decrease, I think it's pretty remarkable, up to like 60% of their ability to provide a posteriorly directed shear force gets eliminated when you fully flex the spine. Because now you're changing the orientation of those erector spinae fibers and they become more parallel, so they create more of a compressive force rather than more of a posterior force that's going to resist the anterior force from your exterior load.
Now, yeah, that you're really hitting on great stuff there, and I appreciate it. Would it matter also if there was no load? So do a lot of these things that you're mentioning, right? So for example, dancers, flex their spine and move their spine in different or weird ways, or yoga does that, but it's okay because there's no load there. So are we considering load in this factor, such as like too much too soon type of thing?
Yes, and depending on whom it is that you talk to, different people will have different opinions. Stuart McGill, who's one of the leading spinal researchers, would say, hey, you can put a lot of motion into the spine. You can put a lot of load on the spine, but you don't want to do both at the same time. Right? And I would agree with you that we're built to have a spine that has all these different functional spinal units that have motion associated with them. So we never want to have a situation where we just completely fuse all of our vertebra and never to allow any motion to occur whatsoever. The spine is designed to move. We just don't want to be moving that spine under a heavy compressive load.
Right. Yeah, it seems like load, changes that a bit. So it's like I think when people say, there is no good technique, like, yeah, the body's capable, I think, of moving in all these different ways. However, when you start to add load to the equation, we have to consider what that load is doing and how we need to respond to that load. And it does change a bit once you're adding load.
Yeah, and the more load you add, the more that restricts or constrains the way you're performing a squat. So if you're doing a squat with a fairly light load, you can get away with doing it in several different ways. And the heavier you go, the more that starts to collapse around a very small number of ways to perform that. And there's going to be reasons associated with that as well. If we're sticking with the back squat and you want to lift as heavy as you possibly can, that's going to require a great contribution from those hip extensors. And so you are going to have a little bit more of that forward lean so that you can, of your forward lean of your trunk, so that you can engage those hip extensors in order to lift as much as you possibly can.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems like like you say, higher stress, lower variety, lower stress, you can increase variety. And
Mhm.
that kind of seems like a rule, just like, even in survival, right? As we're
Yep.
increasing stress, you're going to limit the amount of responses you have. You might stick to what you're good at, even outside of movement, just generally speaking. The more stress you place on something, the less you're going to start taking risks and doing weird stuff or doing something different,
Mhm.
or even being creative. Like you'll probably be less creative. And that's really what dance and some of those other things are. It's like your body moving in a creative way.
Mhm.
Um, you mentioned the piece about the spine not moving so much. I remember Mike Boyle back in the day would say anti-rotation, anti-flexion. Um, so not to drift too far from the squat, but would you say it's good to train the torso in that way where it's resisting um, extension or resisting rotation or resisting some of those things, thinking more like a plank or something of that fashion as opposed to moving like a curl up?
I think it really depends again on what you are training for.
Mm,
And I think you have to realize that there is no good or bad exercises. There is no right or wrong exercises. They are all what exercises what are you trying to accomplish with that particular exercise you're doing? What is the
mm,
actual goal? And if we
mm,
think about what the spine needs to do, and let's just stick with the spine in sport, right? There are definitely compressive strategies that are necessary. If
mm,
you are a football player and you're going to get hit, if you're a hockey player, you're going to get checked against the boards, then yeah, you are going to want to engage that musculature around the spine and basically lock the thorax on the pelvis because you want to have this compressive strategy so that nothing moves.
mm,
Now, if we take a look at, let's say, a soccer throw in, if we're doing a soccer throw in, now you're going to have extension and then flexion of the spine. So you need to have more of this linear elastic strategy for your abdominal musculature to perform that particular activity.
mm,
If we
mm,
look at somebody who is going to hit a baseball or look at tennis, if you look or throwing a baseball, right? In that case, right there, one of the major components to success is going to be shoulder pelvic separation. So
mm,
you are going to have a big rotation associated with that. And you are going to end up where you are going to use this spiral elastic strategy.
mm,
So if that is your particular sport, then you have to learn to be able to use that. If
mm,
we look at somebody who's running or sprinting, now they're going to use more of this diagonal elastic strategy because they're going to have what's sometimes referred to as a quote unquote false rotation, where you're
mm,
having the pelvis moving in the opposite direction of the thorax and vice versa with every step you take.
mm.
So I don't think that it's appropriate to say that every instance requires a compressive strategy
Right.
or that it's even a good thing to have a compressive strategy for that.
Yeah. Yeah. Very point well taken. Um, I'm thinking again, like as you're talking, I'm thinking about that piece about not differentiating knee dominant, hip dominant, or necessarily that squat has to be classified as a knee dominant. Would you differentiate a squat from a deadlift then? Would you say that they're two different things biomechanically or task wise?
So I would turn around and say to you, what type of squat and what type of deadlift?
Right. So my assumption is that there's going to be a variety of squats and deadlifts, and both are going to have a different variety of hip and knee contribution.
Right.
Right. Right.
Yeah. So if we were to say compare a stiff-legged deadlift,
Mm,
where with a stiff-legged deadlift, we're now trying to minimize the amount of knee flexion extension,
mm,
right? So now we're changing from that lower extremity flexion extension pattern to a lower extremity hinging pattern.
mm,
And yes, that's going to create, again, great demands about the hip for the hip extensors. And now if we're bringing that load, so that load is now going to be anterior or in front of where the knee joint center is, now we're actually going to be changing that demand from being a demand on the quads and the knee extensors to be a demand on the hamstrings and the knee flexors. because
Mm,
as soon as that load goes anterior, now it's going to want to cause the knee to extend. So now you need to engage your knee flexors in order to prevent that knee extension from occurring.
mm. So it seems to me like squat and deadlift doesn't matter as much. If you're trying to differentiate, you can just say a knee dominant exercise and a hinging exercise, but there could be many different squats or deadlifts that fall into those buckets.
Yes, absolutely. And then you also have to be careful about load,
Mm,
because some early studies that have compared, say, a front squat to a back squat have shown that there's greater demand on the knee extensors with a front squat compared to a
mm,
back squat. Kind of keeping in mind with what I was saying before about the more upright your trunk is, the greater demand is going to be on those knee extensors.
mm,
But a problem with some of those early studies was that they were done with the same load.
mm,
Now, of course, it's going to be highly individualized, but if we just spitball it and let's just say that your front squat is 85% of your back squat, that means that you're squatting with 15% more with a back squat. And when
mm,
there's been studies that have looked at an absolute rather than relative load, they have shown that even though the back squat technically has a smaller moment arm about the knee, which would mean that the demand would be less, the fact that you're squatting with a greater weight with the back squat compared to the front squat, you could end up with an even greater demand on the knee with the back squat compared to the front squat.
mm. Very interesting.
And then on top of all that, we have to throw in, well, then how deep are you going to want to go?
Right.
Because once you start adding depth into the equation, that's going to start changing things around as well. There was a study that was done by Lauren Chu up in Canada where he looked at increasing both load and depth and seeing how that changed the relative muscular effort about the hip, the knee, and the ankle. And if we look at what happens with the ankle, we see that there would be an increase in the relative muscular effort with an increase in load, but not necessarily with an increase in depth.
Mm,
And if you look at what happens with the knee extensors, there was an increase in relative muscular effort with an increase in depth, but not with an increase in load.
mm,
And then if you look at what goes on with the relative muscular effort at the hip, we see that that increased with both load and with depth. So
mm,
you see how, and that's just with a back squat. So now you see how it gets very tricky to just make general characterizations about one exercise compared to another, because you have to consider, okay, what exercise am I using? Are we going to compare a relative or an absolute load? How deep are we going to be going? So it makes the comparisons a lot more difficult and a lot less universal than a lot of people would like to think.
mm. All right. So, yeah, a lot of very good points there. So if somebody was just starting out, do you think that there's a better place to start when it comes to squatting patterns? Is one maybe easier or biomechanically in any way? Like, would you choose one over another for any reason?
I would actually, first of all, start with just a dowel rod. So I'll start
Mm,
there. So just like a plastic PVC pipe or something like that.
right.
And my personal go-to would probably be a box squat.
Mm,
And so for those of your audience who aren't familiar, a box squat is your shins are almost going to stay completely vertical, and you're just going to sit back onto a box, and then you're going to come back up to your upright position.
mm,
And I like that because you can really standardize how deep you want somebody to go, because you say, all right, I'm going to set up my box this height, and you're going to go till your butt hits that box, and then you're going to come back up. And then gradually, as their technique gets better, we can lower that lower and lower, and they can have a target that they absolutely have to hit.
mm,
And I'm looking for things again, like can they disassociate hip flexion from spinal flexion? Can they perform the lower extremity flexion pattern without going into valgus collapse? So those are some of the things that I'm looking for in terms of that. Another one that I find intriguing, which I haven't played around with as much, and again, this was also done by Lauren Chu up in Canada, is he does what he refers to as a plate squat,
mm,
where he takes a bumper plate and has somebody hold that bumper plate literally on top of their head. And then he puts a volleyball on top of the bumper plate.
Hmm.
And then he says, squat. And you got to figure out, okay, now how am I going to squat while keeping that ball? And so you can see if you start to go too much in one direction or the other, you're going to end up dumping that ball. And I think that that's an intriguing thing that I would really like to play around with sometime.
Hmm. Are you okay with when it comes to the box squat, or do you want people to remain more upright, or are you okay with the torso tilting?
Oh no, you actually want to have the torso tilt. You're actually, one of the cues that I would use is that you're
Yeah.
pushing your butt back as you're
Mm,
sitting down. So your butt goes down and back.
mm,
And the box squat was really popularized by Louis Simmons out
mm,
of Westside Barbell, who was a powerlifting coach, as a
mm.
way to improve their box squat. And they would do it with some ungodly poundages.
Right.
But as I said, I do like the idea. No, you're not trying to stay vertical. You're actually trying to get that hip back
Mm.
and come down and hit that target and then come back up.
Do you load the box squat, or are you just using that as a guide with body weight until they're able to do it without it?
You can do both. You can do
Right.
both. As I said, Louis Simmons and the West Side Gang that popularized it, they were doing it with ungodly amounts of weight, like over 500 pounds easy.
Mm. Yeah, I remember, and you tell me your expert opinion on this, but I feel like I remember someone saying, oh, when it comes to the box squat, having too much weight on your back, some people will rest when when they hit the box, they'll kind of relax maybe. And
Mm-hmm.
when you have a bit of a weight on your back, that could be detrimental, you know, whereas like if you are able to actually remain locked through the whole movement, but you know, I feel like I remember someone saying they were concerned that people would relax when they'd hit the box when they have too much weight on there. Or, you know, are there any maybe injury concerns that you might consider with it?
Not that I would necessarily consider to be unique to a box squat.
Right,
I would consider, I would have the same issues associated with a regular squat or a back
right,
squat or front squat or any type of squat. And I
right.
think maybe if you're going to talk about injuries associated with squatting, I think the number one culprit would probably be too much load.
Mm,
And I think that in order to have any increase in load, an athlete, and I'll call all your clients or all your people athletes, because I think everybody's an athlete depending on how much we're training or not.
yep.
But I think every athlete has to earn an increase in load,
Mm,
right?
mm,
And that they have to show, okay, I can do this with a PVC pipe. All right, now we're going to move to an unloaded barbell.
yep.
Can you do this with an unloaded barbell? And
Mm,
I don't care who you are or how proficient you think you are. To me, if you're going to train under me, that's exactly where you're going to start. Because
mm,
I've seen some pretty elite athletes that had pretty horrible techniques.
yeah, yeah. Um, when it comes to, so this is a common thing I'll hear from clients, and would love for you to address as well. So they feel as though once they start to tilt, right? So once you start going into more of this hinging pattern, that you're putting stress on the back. Should people be concerned about stress on the lower back? Should they remain more upright for that reason? Or that doesn't matter? It's the same progressive overload that you're doing when it comes to the knee and the quad and everything else.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of that depends on the load's got to go somewhere,
Right.
right? And so if we go more upright, now you're talking about potentially having greater shearing forces or greater compressive forces on the knee or the patellofemoral joint.
Mm,
So the load's got to go somewhere.
right.
The question is, where is that load going to go? And again, I would not be concerned about it, provided that somebody, A, progresses up to the load that they're using and earns that load by showing me that they can keep the curves for whatever depth they're going with whatever load they're going with.
Mm,
And I do
right.
not think that it's going to be an issue if you are doing it with proper technique. But
Right.
again, I think too many people will sacrifice their technique while they're chasing loads, and then that's when they run into trouble.
Right. So for people that maintain a neutral spine and take proper progressive overload, hinging and tilting is not going to be a problem.
Not at all. Not at
Yeah.
all.
Yeah.
If you,
That's
if
always a
you,
good one to address.
yeah. And this is something that I will often talk to, and I talk to a lot of different healthcare professionals in different settings, is that I always say that if somebody has a bad back, you have to teach them how to squat and deadlift.
Right.
And people look at me like I have three heads, and I'm like, well, wait a minute here. If they're not teaching them to deadlift, how are they going to pick something up off the floor?
Right.
If you're not teaching them how to squat, how are they going to get in and out of a chair? How are they going to get on and off a toilet? So
Right.
we're doing these motions all of the time. They're not inherently bad or dangerous, although there are inherently bad or dangerous ways to perform them.
Mm. Especially as you're considering load and as you're
Mm-hmm.
considering people aging and certain loads that weren't an issue before might become an issue later on. So,
Mm-hmm.
right. And to your point, I like that, right? You are squatting and deadlifting all day. You pick something up off the floor, you sit down, you use the bathroom, you're already doing it. So I'm curious how you're doing it. What is your
Right.
current pattern for picking that thing up? And let me help you correct that. And doesn't necessarily have to be even adding load to it yet. We'll take the progressive approach to that. But I want your squat and your deadlift to be on point because you're using it every day.
Mm-hmm. And I'll also throw range of motion or depth in there as well.
Right.
If we're talking about somebody doing a stiff-legged deadlift and they have fairly tight hamstrings, they're only going to
Mm,
be able to go so far
mm,
before their hamstrings are going to limit their motion. And then when the hamstrings limit their motion, what are they going to do if they need to get lower? They're going to end up flexing the spine. Well,
mm.
again, that goes against the rule of keeping the curves, keeping that neutral spine. So it could be that we not only have to consider load, we have to consider depth or range of motion associated with that as well, and
Mm.
potentially work on increasing their ability to get lower as well as their ability to use heavier loads.
Is there a way to help people get lower? I know I see a lot of people put their heels on plates when they don't have the ankle mobility or other. What do you think about that? And do you have any other strategies?
Well, I think, and I'm going to go a little tongue in cheek here, right? And if we're talking about an athlete, I will allow them to raise their heels if they're going to wear high heels out on their court or out on the field. But if they're not wearing high heels out on the court or out on the field, then I would say, I don't know about that.
Mm,
I think really the best way to tackle these range of motion deficits is through movement, is through motion.
mm,
So if we just take, let's say, the deadlift, for example, right, is that we're going to have them do the deadlift. And now maybe I'm going to take two boxes, and boxes can be fairly small, right? They don't need to be huge. They can be fairly small or very fairly short. But I'm going to have two boxes, and I'm going to have the plates on either side of the barbell elevated.
mm,
And then again, if they can show me that they can go to that depth while keeping the curves, then we can start removing some of that height where they would get lower and lower and lower.
mm.
And so I think that that would be a good progression. You want to talk about a good way to just getting lower in terms of your squat. And this doesn't have to be a lot of load. In fact, I would suggest it wouldn't be a lot of load, but to take
Mm,
a fairly maybe light load, go into the bottom of the squat and just hang out there for a while.
mm,
Hanging out in the bottom position of the squat is going, that additional load is going to help to improve that range of motion.
mm. Yeah, a lot of good points. Would you say that there's a difference between squatting with load like you would in the gym and maybe, for example, like a resting squat and a deep squat, like biomechanically? So oftentimes I think, again, like you said, you're trying to maintain that. Can I say neutral spine when you're
Yeah.
saying maintain the curves? Uh, you know, you want to maintain that neutral spine. However, I feel like when I see that someone's in a resting deep squat where they're kind of relaxed there, that they'll lose some of that and they'll start to flex a bit.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to me like that is probably okay in that scenario, A, because you don't have load. B, the flexion might put the diaphragm in a little bit of a better position, maybe, maybe not for breathing if you're trying to recover. Um, would you say that there's a difference between a resting recovery type of squat and one that you would do in the gym for weight training?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this goes back to what we were saying before about the spine can have motion, does have motion, needs to have motion, right?
Mm,
You just don't necessarily want to have that motion under a heavy load.
right.
And so, yeah, I mean, if we look at some of the Asian cultures, for example, that's their normal position they get into when they're resting or even using the toilet, that, yeah, I thousands of years of evidence shows that, they're not all walking around with bad backs because of it.
Mm.
Right. So again, I think the fact that you aren't loading that position right there, there's nothing wrong with flexing the spine in that particular condition.
Do you think it's helpful to flex the spine in that position? Maybe like the only thing that I think about is the position of the diaphragm. I don't know how familiar you are with PRI and some of that stuff. Are you familiar with
I am not
postural?
that familiar with it,
Yeah.
no.
So I kind of dabbled in them a little, but the diaphragm's like just a big buzz.
Mhm.
But that's the only thing that I see there as a potential benefit that maybe you would, little flexion could actually be beneficial if you're recovering or you're trying to recover. I think about there was some studies done with when people were in the recovery position with the arms over their head. This one was in the NSCA, or versus like the elbows on the knees and kind of hunched over. And the elbows on the knees and the hunched over position was superior for recovery. And I don't know exactly why, this is me guessing, but my assumption is having a flex spine could potentially be better for recovery. And that's the exact opposite of what you would want in the gym setting because you're not recovering, you're exercising, you're working hard, but they almost kind of flip flop on each other a bit. The rules kind of change, it seems, when it's a deep squat for resting.
I'm really not familiar with that research, and I don't know
Okay.
how they are defining recovery
Mm.
in that context to really be able to speak intelligently about it.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, I have to double check myself how they were, what was the measure for recovery? Was it heart rate? Was it what? I don't remember exactly. But I remember the conclusion being the hands on the knees was a superior position. But yeah, I would have to do some more homework on that too.
But
But
circling back to your point, though,
yeah,
is the spine was built to move,
right.
right? I mean, we run into all sorts of problems that we see in individuals who have spinal fusion surgeries.
Mm,
So the spine was built to move. And another universal truth is if you don't use it, you lose it.
mm,
So again, I would say no, we don't always want to walk around with our thorax locked onto our pelvis and have no motion in that spine whatsoever because the spine was built to move. The spine does need to move,
mm.
and it does need to move in all three planes depending on what particular activities we're using and which of the spinal strategies that I talked about a little bit earlier we're employing at the time.
So do you think people should strategically embed some other types of movement in their exercise program that maybe includes, um, you know, maybe movement without a neutral spine?
Do I think that you need to flex and extend the spine? Absolutely. Do I think that you need to work on pelvic shoulder separation if you are a throwing athlete of any sort? Absolutely.
Mm, mm. Yeah, I just think about myself as like more of an everyday type of person. Complementing a good resistance training program with maybe dance or yoga day or something where or Brazilian jiu-jitsu, the spine is kind of moving in these more dynamic ways or more variety. So complementing this rigid resistance training with something that's a bit more flexible could have some potential benefit.
Yeah, and I really think that you need to look in terms of it always goes back to what is the purpose of this particular exercise?
Right.
Is the purpose of this particular exercise to build capacity? If the
Mm,
purpose is to build capacity, then yeah, you want to load up, you want to go heavy, you're going to do kind of more of that rigid type of stuff that you're doing. If the purpose of that exercise is to be more coordinative in nature, right, where you're trying to improve coordination, then in that particular case, you absolutely want to be moving, and you want to be moving in all three dimensions, and you want to be able to control movement in all three of those dimensions. So it
Mm.
kind of always
Love it.
goes back to, why am I doing what it is that I'm doing?
Mm.
Where is it that I'm deficient in terms of my ability to move? And
Mm.
I think we all gravitate towards the things we're good at and the things that we like to do. And we
Mm.
tend to avoid the things that we're not good at and the things that we don't like to do.
Yep.
But just like I asked earlier, what's going to be more important, the fruits or the vegetables? Well, the one that's going to be more important is probably the one that you're deficient in.
Mm.
And
So
so I would
true.
say the same thing as it relates to movement. The most important exercises are probably the ones you're not doing.
Mm. So when it comes to exercise technique or cues that you might use in a squat, it sounds to me there's a couple things that you hit on already, but one, first off, what squat are we talking about? Are we
Mhm.
talking about a back squat, a front squat, a goblet squat, a box squat? All these might change the game a little bit. But generally speaking, if we were to take a box squat or a good, almost any of them, it sounds like a neutral spine and maintaining the knee over the foot as opposed to the knee valgus are probably the two big cues that you would give. Are there any other cues that people should think about, whether you're a coach or whether you're an athlete?
Instead of cues, I really like to think in terms potentially of constraints. And
Mm.
maybe we're kind of mixing terminology a little bit here, but I really like, if we go back to the idea of that plate squat, right?
Mm.
Is that you're not really giving people cues on how to do it. You're saying, all right, here's the task at hand. We're going to put this bumper plate on top of your head. You're going to hold a volleyball on top of the bumper plate, or you're going to put a volleyball on top of that bumper plate, and you got to figure it out.
Mm.
You got to figure out how to squat without dropping the ball. And then you let them figure it out rather than trying to overload them with information.
Mm. I'm
One
going to use
technique,
that one, by the way.
one technique that I also like to use in terms of having people keep the curves.
Mm.
So I'll just take simple 1.5 inch white athletic tape, and
Mm.
I'll put it down one side of the spine and then the other side of the spine while they're in a neutral position.
Mm.
And if they end up flexing the spine while they're going into a squat, it's going to pull on that tape. And
Mm.
that's going to give them feedback that, oh, I'm doing this.
Mm.
And so I like the idea of coming up with constraints as a way of forcing somebody to perform the movement the way I would prefer them to do it, rather than
Mm.
trying to overload them with a whole bunch of different information in terms of, oh, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. To
Right.
say, here is, I'm going to constrain this task in a particular way. You got to figure out how to make it work.
So are those the two big things though that you would be looking for? Is the knee and the spine? That's pretty much the biggest bang for your buck right there.
I think those are the two major ones. I think that there are probably other, maybe smaller things to be looking at, like
Mm.
maybe the position of the head,
Mm.
depending on the person, and what context we're in. But I would say that those two are the two major ones. I don't like the fact of trying to make everybody squat the same exact way, because we're
Mm.
all built differently. We all have these different sets of internal constraints that are going to dictate the way that we perform a particular squat. And somebody who's 5'4" is not going to squat the same way as somebody who's 7'2",
Mm.
right? And we have to just respect those individual differences and figure out how to get somebody performing the squat that's the best way to perform it for them.
Mm. Quick question about the ball on the head. If um if I have the ball in my head, I probably wouldn't be able to.
Right. You have to be more upright.
I
Correct.
have to be more upright. So I guess that would work best for a squat that is more upright because there are
Correct.
some squats you
Mm-hmm.
said that you can tilt.
Yes.
So that wouldn't work for that scenario. So it's like it's okay to tilt, but that's not what this drill is
Exactly.
teaching.
Yes.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Love it. Um, People used to say ass to grass. Uh, you know, we should be getting low. Is that something people should look for? I guess I feel like you kind of hit on it already, but I just want to isolate that question.
Yeah. It's going to go back to what are you training the squat for?
Yeah.
And what is it that you need to do? And
Mm,
again, I'm just going to go with some very general numbers here. But I think if we say you're going to go parallel, let's say parallel is our baseline position. And
mm,
let's just say that's going to be 100%. If you're going to break parallel, if you're going to go below parallel, now you're talking maybe 94, maybe 96% of what you could handle if you were going parallel. If you're going to go above parallel, let's say you're going to go to 90 degrees. Now maybe you're going to 116% of the load that you were doing when you were going to parallel. And so I think, first of all, the first question to ask is, why am I having this person squat? What is it that I'm asking them to achieve? Second of all, can they actually go below parallel while still maintaining proper form? And again, it gets back to the fruits and vegetable things. Maybe sometimes we want to go with a heavier load and not break parallel.
mm,
Maybe sometimes we want to go with a lower load a lighter load and break parallel and go ass to grass. And so I
mm,
think that there is arguments to be had for doing both. And
mm,
depending on what it is that we're training somebody for, if we're training somebody for a sport, we have to see how low is it that they actually have to go. If we're training somebody for everyday movement competency, then I say there is no one single solution and that we should be employing a variety of different depths and different loads.
love it. Would you say that there's a point where performance can end up sacrificing injury? And what I mean by that, I'll give an example with more like the bench press, for example, right? Um, I think you'll see a lot of power lifters with maybe an extreme arch.
Mm-hmm.
Some people might say the extreme arch can get you to lift more. However, it might come with a bit of a price. I had someone on the podcast that was in reference to swimming and swimming biomechanics. And he said the arm angle really matters, where there's a point where, and I forgot the exact number he gave, but let's say, I don't know, it was past 90 degrees or something like that. Once you go past 90 degrees, you start to put a little, you start to put a lot of torque on the shoulder. And even though that torque will help give you power, it ends up running the risk of injury. So there was this point where you're getting more performance, you're getting more power. However, you may want to scale back a little for the sake of injury. Is there anything like that in regard to the squat where doing this will help you to, lift more per se, but it might be something you want to be wary of?
So I mean, I'm going to keep going back to why are you performing the squat
Yeah,
and can you earn the load that you're going to do? And if
right,
we are going to assume that you are not a competitive power lifter where the squat is your particular sport, then I'm not interested in necessarily adding more weight onto the bar. I'm going
right.
to be more interested in their ability to be able to produce force in different positions with different varieties, as opposed
Mm,
to just trying to add more and more weight to one particular movement pattern.
mm. Yeah, I love the point of variety too. That's, a solid one. And anytime I think about, the difference between performance and maybe health span, right? And where they might differentiate. Health span tends to need more variety, and performance needs to have less variety, right? You need to be good at this one thing.
Right.
So yeah, that's a really solid point. It's like it really is not going to matter as much. It just matters that you're doing some variety in this, and then you're earning your rights with proper progressive overload.
Yeah, there was
Um,
a study that was done a number of years ago, and the lead author now escapes me, but they actually looked at performing different periodization schemes. In
hmm,
one case, they had constant exercise and they had variable loads, which is your classic periodization scheme. In
hmm,
another one, they had a constant load and a constant exercise, which would be non-periodization. In one case, they had variable exercise with constant load. And in another case, they had variable exercise with variable load.
Mm.
And of those four different conditions, I believe the one they found to be the superior one was the uh, variable exercise constant load. Now,
Mm.
we can't put all of our eggs into one basket when it comes to examining research studies. We
Mm.
actually need to have several different studies before we start to confirm something. But I think it does lend credence to the idea that we have to have a variety of exercises that we do, and that we shouldn't just be locked into a few exercises, unless, of course, those exercises are your particular sport.
Right. Yeah, I went to Thailand many years ago. When I was there, they would, it's popular that people would say same, but different.
Mm-hmm.
And when I think about my exercise programming, a lot of times I would think of that same, but different. Like
Mm-hmm.
I'm kind of going after the same thing. It's a squatting pattern, but I'm going to do it in a little bit of a different way. Maybe one time I'm doing the front squat, another time I'm doing the back squat. But it's the same thing, almost a little bit different. But yeah, just, you have those general patterns that you're going after, and then there's a variety of ways to go after those patterns. Um, when it comes to single leg and bilateral, do people compensate? So, like, if I'm doing a bilateral squat, do some people maybe use one side more than the other? Is it worth doing single leg work to be able to get some balance in there, or does it even matter? What are your thoughts on that?
So, yeah, there's a lot to unpack there as well. I actually
Mm.
did a study where we looked at bilateral differences
Mm.
while performing the squat and doing that under different loads. And
Mm.
that, yes, there were people, most people, depending on which loading condition they were doing, most people tend to favor one side versus the other. Now, as a general rule, and I don't know if this is even a rule or probably more like a guideline,
Mm.
is people will tend to say that if bilateral differences are less than 10%, you really shouldn't worry about it. And
Mm.
that when bilateral differences get greater than 10%, then you could potentially have to start worrying about it.
Mm.
So with that in mind, I would say that probably most healthy people, although in my study, people were in the low teens in terms of their bilateral differences, in terms of
Mm.
demand that were placed at the ankle, knee, and hip. I don't know if they'd be that great to worry about.
Mm.
Now, if we kind of flip that on its head and we look at somebody that had ACL reconstructive surgery, what we find with people who have ACL reconstructive surgery is they tend to unload that leg that they had surgery on. And one of the long-term consequences of unloading that knee is that later in life, they tend to develop knee osteoarthritis.
Mm.
And so one of the things we have to do is we have to get them loading that knee. And a way in which you can potentially do that, another one also, Lauren Chu out of Canada came up with this one as well, was in terms of doing a bilateral squat, he took the unaffected leg and he raised it up on a platform. Now,
Mm.
that platform was about 5 centimeters, I believe, so a little bit over 2 inches. And when he did that, you can see that if this leg is higher than this leg, you're going to put more load onto this leg.
Right.
So that would be a potential way to address that. In terms of the whole single leg versus double leg, I think it requires you to kind of think through it and come back to why is it that I'm performing this particular exercise? And if what I'm trying to do is build capacity and you want to go heavy, you want to go on two legs because as soon as you go onto one leg, you're bringing more coordinative type of challenges to that particular exercise, which is fine if that is what you want to do, right? So it all kind of comes back to why is it that I want to do this particular exercise?
Mm.
Also, if you're in a time crunch, you don't necessarily want to go into doing a lot of unilateral work because that's going to double your workout time than if
Right.
you did things bilaterally.
Right.
I do think there's benefit to doing unilateral work, and I like to do a lot of unilateral work, but I do that unilateral work again when I'm leaning more on that whole spectrum of going towards the coordinative structure type of work as
Mm.
opposed to just trying to build raw capacity.
Yeah. Yeah. Good point. Uh, this is a little bit of a selfish question, but how are you assessing them when for example, that bilateral, like what tools are you using to assess that?
So in that particular study, that was a full-on biomechanical comparison where we had force platforms, which for your audience that don't know what a force platform is, those are really like fancy analog scales that are built flush into the ground. That gives us, according to Newton's third law, for every force, there's an equal and opposite reaction force. For every force that we put in the ground, there's an equal and opposite reaction force that comes back onto us.
Mm.
So in our biomechanical lab, we'll have people squatting on a force platform, and then we'll also marker them up with all of the same technology that they use in the animation space, where they have, all the markers on somebody when they're digitizing their movement.
Mm.
So we'll digitize their movement, plus we'll measure the forces they're putting into the ground. And from that, we can look at the torque that they're developing about the ankle, knee, and hip in order to do a full-on biomechanical analysis of that.
And if you were assessing, I guess, the difference between knee depth and hip depth, I'm sure you have fancy equipment for that too, but could people, I'm curious actually what that fancy equipment is, but can people do just video analysis, and maybe draw little angles on it?
They can, and that'll give you a rough guesstimate about what's happening.
Mm.
But one of the problems is that just looking at the kinematics and not having the kinetics is you're not getting the full picture.
Mm.
And there is a big movement within the biomechanics community to try and go to what we call markerless motion capture.
Mm.
So we don't have to put little markers all over people in order to correct that. But that work is still really in its infancy.
Mm.
And without having the ability to measure forces, you're really limited just looking at your kinematics. I
Mm.
think it's better than nothing. And if I would
Right.
say your average coach or average clinician is probably going to end up just, using one of the many motion analysis apps that are out there. And I think that those are helpful and that they'll give you a general guide in terms of what's happening. But if
Mm.
you really want to look at understanding the differences associated with depth or load or exercise variations, I think you really have to go to the literature where people are doing it with all this fancy equipment.
Mm. Oh, yeah, I agree. So we're slowly coming to a close. I have two more questions for
Sure.
you.
Mm-hmm.
Stable versus unstable surfaces. Does it matter? I mean, I have a feeling where you're going with this, but sometimes I think it's good to be explicit and ask certain questions because it's very popular nowadays. You maybe see people squatting on a Bosu ball or something like that, but what are your thoughts on stable versus unstable?
So first, again, I'm going to ask my question of what is it that you are training for?
Right.
And why is it that you need that training? We know that training on unstable surfaces tends to lead to a decrease in the load that you can lift
Mm.
and an increase in co-contraction. So you're basically firing all the muscles around the different joints because you're afraid that something's going to buckle in one direction or the other.
Mm.
So that is something that we tend to see with that. But I would go back to, well, why are you training with what you're training? Like, what
Mm.
is the purpose of that? And me personally, and I don't know if I've really got any literature to back this up, but me personally, I would say maybe we got it backwards
Mm.
because we got all these people that want to train with a stable load on an unstable surface,
Mm.
which maybe if you are a downhill skier, maybe if you're a surfer, that's where you need to be. But I would think that for most of us, we're moving on a stable surface with an unstable load.
Mm.
So maybe that's the direction we need to go and not go looking at, hey, we're going to be on these unstable surfaces, but we're going to be on a stable surface. We're going to be on terra firma, and then we're going to play around with unstable type of equipment.
Mm.
If you look at a lot of strongman competitions, right, the loads aren't that heavy. Now, don't
Mm.
get me wrong, they're heavy for me. I probably
Right.
couldn't do that. But if you asked any of those guys to pick up, or I should say to deadlift on a barbell, the weight of an Atlas stone, they do it like that. But
Right.
now you got something that's big, it's bulky, it's uneven, it's awkward to hold. Now you're talking about making something harder to do, which I think would have much more applicability to the real world.
Yeah.
And you don't have to go like all strongman in terms of doing stuff like that. You could, for example, if you were training, the little old lady from Pasadena, get a half-filled milk carton,
Yeah.
have her press up the half-filled milk carton, and now that fluid is jostling around as she's lifting it up. To me, that just seems to be much more applicable in terms of real world transfer than it would be to doing some of the circus acts that I see some people trying to do.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that a lot. You're making me think about the sandbag squat where people throw it over one
Mm-hmm.
shoulder and things like that. And I like the way your mind is going with that.
Do a overhead squat with one kettlebell on one side,
Right. Right.
or something that people don't often think about is if you take a barbell, maybe play around with not having an even distribution of plates on either side.
Mm.
Maybe have 5 or 10 pounds less on one side versus the other.
Right. Right. That's
Another
interesting.
tool that we have down in the lab that we're starting to play around with to see how this works is it's a bamboo bar. So rather than just being a stiff traditional barbell, when you move this bar, it starts to oscillate because it's flexible.
Mm.
It's not
Oh,
it's not firm steel. And so I think that that might be another interesting avenue of pursuing to say what happens when you start, using these types of things to
right.
perform your different exercises. So yeah, there's lots of different ways in which you can go. I've seen people also take a barbell and hang kettlebells
Yep.
the
I've seen
barbell.
that.
So now
Yep.
they swing, right? So if you want to play in the unstable space, to me, it would just make more sense to go the route of trying to play around with unstable loads on stable surfaces rather than stable loads on unstable surfaces.
I love that. Yeah, so the last question here was around the muscles that you're using. Some people are targeting muscles because they want certain muscles to grow. So they want quad development versus hamstring versus glute. Um, if you could differentiate the three, is there a certain exercise that would hit one muscle more than another? And those are really just the big three I'm thinking about: the quad, the hamstring, and the glute.
So hamstrings, I'll start with hamstrings. That might be the easiest. The hamstring curl is going to be a great one, right? Because that's going to isolate it. So that's
Mm,
just going to make it so it has to be the hamstrings. The Nordic curl is another excellent exercise for hamstrings.
mm.
The
And not sorry, not to cut you off. In the realm of squatting in particular, is for example, would you say that hamstrings are not really the best thing to target in a squat, and it's better to target in other places? So yeah, more so in the realms of squatting. And is there maybe if you have a deep squat that'll hit the glute more? Um, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so as I said, if we wanted to talk about differentiating the demand on the different muscle groups,
Mm,
I would say that if you really wanted to target the glutes, to go with a box squat, where
mm,
you're, again, because if you want to target the glutes, those hip extensors, you have to have a fairly large trunk inclination angle, right? You have to get your trunk down fairly low, which I think the box squat does a pretty good job at.
mm.
If you wanted to target the hamstrings, I would probably, like, the hamstrings are involved with the squat, don't get me wrong. But if I really probably wanted to go after the hamstrings, I would probably be looking more at that stiff-legged deadlift
Mm,
or a sumo deadlift or something along those lines, because
mm.
I think those would be more demanding on the hamstrings than would one of your squat varieties.
And what does it? Is it that there's less knee bend and more
Yes.
torso?
Less knee bend, more torso, and the fact that you're now moving that load in front of the knee. When you start moving a load in front of the knee, that load is no longer going to cause the knee to flex. It's going to cause the knee to extend. So therefore, now your hamstrings have to work to prevent knee extension while creating hip extension.
So as the hip goes back into space, that's probably more glute.
Yes.
Whereas the torso falling forward would be more hamstring.
Right. But if you're going to have your glutes go back, if you're going to have your hip go back, you have to have your trunk go forward. Otherwise, you're going to fall down. So there has to be some of that postural adjustments there. If I specifically wanted to target the knee or the quads, and I don't know if you'll count this, I might be cheating. I don't know if you'll count this as actually being a squat, but the step down exercise.
Sure. Yeah.
So the step down, and particularly if you force somebody when they're doing the step down exercise, when they're on top of the step, to actually have their toes off the edge of the step, because then they can't go forward. Because remember, you start going forward, you're going to do more hip. The more upright you are, it's going to be more of your knee. So if you get somebody to put their toes off the edge of that, and now they're doing a step down, where they're just going to go down, do a heel tap, and come back up, that is, I think, going to be, in terms of the exercises that we've examined, that one seems to be the one that was most squat-like that would target the quads.
Yeah. I think that, helps people a bit because, some people will say, I'm doing a squat exercise for my quads. Some will say I'm doing a squat exercise for my glutes. And some will say, and now it just helps people to understand this a bit more. Again, which squat exercise are we talking about? How much knee bend, how much hip hinge, what's happening to your torso? Is your hip going back into space? Gets people thinking a little bit more about this in a way that they could understand it, as opposed to just saying the squat for X, Y, and Z.
Correct.
Yeah, so I mean, those were the bulk of my questions. I always open the floor, just in case there's anything I missed that you want to share. There's no pressure for that, but I always just open the floor in case there's something you wanted to share I missed.
I think we traversed a lot of ground. I think we covered a lot of good stuff. I would say again that to me, variety is the spice of life. And if you are not competing in a particular lifting competition, that you should be varying those exercises so that you are targeting different things in different ways and just moving into different positions and postures that maybe you're not normally in. And that I would, again, my overarching theme for everything is always, what are you doing this exercise for? What is the purpose of this exercise? I think that's where you have to start and know exactly what your purpose is. Do I want to be more coordinative? Do I want to be more capacity driven? That's going to drive which way I'm going to go in terms of doing one thing or another. Do I have all the time in the world and I can train a lot of unilateral exercises, or am I going to be in a super huge time crunch where I need to train bilaterally? And just getting people out of an exercise rut, I think, would be one thing. And then just respecting individual differences in the way people move. We certainly don't have people walk the same way. In fact, you see somebody very well, you just see their silhouette. You can tell who they are just by the way they walk, because we all have a unique neurosignature. So I think we all have to respect the fact that that's going to be different for squats as well, and to keep some fundamental principles and guidelines in mind, and just let people figure out how they need to move that's going to be best for them.
Yeah. You just made me think of one more thing that I just have to ask for my own selfish reasons. But, sometimes when I'm organizing things in my mind, I think of vertical and horizontal. Sometimes I kind of differentiate my day that way. And when I think of squatting, I think that's a bit more vertical. And then horizontal, I think a little bit more sprinting and running. But yeah, like what's your thoughts about a vertical leg day and then more of a horizontal leg day, more like a run and a jump is how I classify it in my mind.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a good way of classifying it, right? It's a good way of potentially thinking about it. because one thing we hadn't even touched on was lunges
Right.
and all the different varieties and different potential ways that you can do a lunge. But I would certainly put lunge more into that horizontal as opposed to a vertical category,
Right.
as well as all manners of sled drags, toes, pushes. It would
Yeah.
all be, prowler pushes and such, or would all be put things I would put more in that horizontal category.
Mm.
Whether or not you want to do them in the same day or whether or not you want to break them up into different days, man, that's going into programming, which is a
Yeah.
whole other can of worms about how to actually program these things and put all these things together. But yeah,
Yeah.
I think that there is a difference between, say, a lunge and a squat.
Mm.
Doing a forward lunge versus a side lunge versus a diagonal lunge versus a backward lunge.
Yeah.
I think that there's so many different possibilities you can go with that. Same thing with towing or pushing a prowler. I think there's just so many different ways in which you can go with that are all awesome.
Mm.
And they're
Yeah.
all great ways to go.
Yeah. Yeah. Look, I feel like I could talk to you all day. We could both keep nerding out on this stuff. We'll have to maybe get another episode another day, maybe a whole conversation on programming one day. But I really appreciate you taking the time, to jump on and have this conversation with me. I appreciate your expertise, and I look forward to, staying connected with you.
All right. Oh, yeah. Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure to come talk to you about this stuff anytime.